right, so the Wheel of Time has kind of returned in popularity in the mainstream because of the Amazon series. And so I wanted to do a video about the series as a whole and whether or not it's sort of worth reading. Now, I've only read the first half of the series at this point, so I've just finished book 7. And so I wanted to do a video on, like, as a first-time reader, will I keep going? What has hooked me? What do I think is valuable about the series? What do I think is annoying about the series? I want to be really, really honest because it is a massive series. There's 15 books. One of them is a prequel. And a lot of people may be a little put off by how big it is. And so I wanted to kind of do a video about my impressions of it so far as a first-time reader, and sort of what I've liked and what I've not liked about it so far, so that you can kind of make an educated decision about whether or not you want to continue it. So let's get started. So I wanted to start off with just a rundown of kind of what the series is about overall. It is a second world high fantasy. It's set both in the extreme past and in the extreme future of a very technologically advanced civilization. Time in this series is very much a circle, and they call it turnings of the wheel. That's where the Wheel of Time comes from. And so things sort of go in cycles, and people can come back. Reincarnation is a big thing in this. And a lot of the knowledge from kind of the peak of this civilization, that's called the Age of Legends, a lot of that knowledge has been lost. And so everyone nowadays, which is kind of I'd say it's kind of equivalent to about 14th, 15th, 16th century Europe, roughly. And people are trying to prevent the upcoming duel between kind of the creator and their dark counterpart, called the Dark One, and that is sort of coming, and it's a final battle, and there's a particular person called the Dragon who is going to be instrumental in defeating the Dark One in that last battle. And so that's sort of what everyone, well, not everyone, but all of the kind of scholars and all of the people who can use magic are preparing for. Which is very cool. And so we follow a group of characters who primarily come from a small village, kind of out of the way of things, and they get drawn into this sort of vast, sweeping set of events that sort of lead them towards this impending final battle. And in this world, there's magic, and it's divided into a male and female half. And the male half of what's called the true source is tainted. It's been tainted by the Dark One. And so if there are any men who can use this magic, it's called channeling, if there are any men that can use it, it can cause madness, and some go mad very quickly, and some, it takes some time. And so for the most part, most of the primary magic users at this point, when the story starts, are women. And it's a group, an order called the Aes Sedai. It's a very structured order with different factions, and they all have different things that they focus on. And so that's kind of where we are when the book starts. And so the story follows these main characters as they get pulled into all of this, and things go from bad to worse really quickly, because there's all kinds of political drama as well. There's invading forces from other nations. There's growing unrest about magic in general. There's a faction of kind of crazy extremists who believe that magic is evil and everyone who practices it should be killed. And it's a very messy kind of situation. And so that's where we kind of start with. All right, so I'm going to start off with the things that I really like about the series so far. The characters are wonderful. You've got a really big cast of characters, but you've got kind of a main set of characters that you follow. There's kind of the 4 or 5 main ones that you sort of stick with the most. And their character arcs are really satisfying. There's a cat in the background. Yes, I know. Their arcs are really satisfying, and you see them grow and change in believable ways. And there's some characters who start off just saying, I'm not going to be a part of this at all, and the pattern, or fate or destiny or however you call it, sort of always manages to sort of bring them back into the flow of things, because it sort of, the universe knows that these people are important, and so it needs to keep them involved, which I really, really loved. And character arcs are definitely one of the main reasons why I do want to keep reading, because, yes, I know, because you want to see where they end up, because there's such a satisfying progression to how they grow and change and get stronger over time. It's kind of like, you see this a lot in like anime, where you have the character who starts off and they're completely untrained, they don't know anything, no abilities, nothing, and then like by the end of it, they're like, you know, battling God or something like that. And so, and you really see them struggle and grow and change. These aren't people who just automatically have powers or automatically good at anything right away. They really are sort of fumbling in the dark, and you see them sort of grow and change over time, which I really, really like. The other thing that I really like about this series is the world building. There's a really deep, compelling lore that drives everything, and it's a world that you really feel like is a living, breathing world, much in the way that Middle Earth feels like a living, breathing world. It's a place that you could live in, and you have a feel for like the geography, the different cultures, the different customs, things like food and music. Like you really feel like this is a place that has its own history, and that you are kind of learning it over time, which I really appreciate. The magic system is also very, very cool. I don't know if I'd really call it a hard magic system, because there are kind of some rules, but for the most part, it's a little hand-wavy. But because it's a gendered system, there is lots of really interesting things that have to do with sort of how the different halves of the magic can interact. For example, like men can't see what women are doing when they're using magic, but women can see what other women are doing, and you know, vice versa. And so there's some abilities that can't affect the other, and there is a lot of moments that really call into question what is really going on with all of this. You know, is it two separate magic systems, or is it one? And you've got people who are trying to use it for their own goals while not really fully understanding it, because like I said, a lot of the knowledge about how this works has been lost. And there's also magical artifacts, some more powerful than others, some can work for anyone, others only work for magic users. And just seeing kind of how the complexity of all of this is revealed to the characters, who over time are kind of figuring out all of this knowledge that was lost thousands of years ago. And so that is really interesting. My next point kind of ties in with the characters one, in that I really love how we have a ton of really strong female characters. Now, there are still some stereotypes that kind of creep in here and there, but for the most part, there's wonderful, strong female characters who exist kind of on their own, and there isn't a sense that they are hindered in any way by who they are. And so I really, really appreciated that. On top of that, I really like how there's so many really positive representations of male characters. There's some really toxic, you know, things in there, but there's some characters that are very good depictions of sort of positive masculinity. They're caring, they're nurturing, they're not afraid to show emotion. You know, there's a very good sense of working together for a lot of these characters. Now, of course, there's some that aren't, and there's some characters who have to kind of grow into that over time, because at first their heads are filled with a lot of outdated modes of thinking. But I really like how we see a lot of these characters deconstruct the things that they were raised with, and move beyond that. And we have a lot of female characters who come from a very kind of rigid, almost puritanical sort of culture, where things like modesty is very important. And so over time, they kind of learn just to be their own person, do whatever they want, and find their own kind of personality. And so you see them kind of blossom over time, which is really satisfying, and I really love seeing that. And finally, I want to talk about the ending of each of the books. Like I said, I've only read the first 7 books so far, but the endings have always been consistently wonderful. There's a good mix of cliffhanger and sort of things that make the book have a purpose, if that makes sense. There's always something at the end that changes the world in fundamental ways, or teaches the character something that they can then use to change the world in fundamental ways going forward. And so it's really, really fun because, you know, the books do tend to be long, but they're never unsatisfying, at least so far. I know there is some books coming up that people refer to as the slog, but for the most part, it's genuinely engaging enough that I do want to keep reading. The endings are always really interesting and really satisfying, and always leave me having finished the book with a sense of, okay, I have to read the next one. This is really important. So now I want to move on to the things that have frustrated me so far with the series. For one thing, the books do tend to be very long, and not all of them use that space wisely. So a book like, you know, the second book, The Great Hunt, it is a big one, but I feel like the pacing in this one is really fantastic. You are drawn through, and you follow everything, and everything kind of fits together, and so the pacing is very consistent and steady, and it really pulls you along in interesting ways, which I really, really liked. Now, with that said, there's some other ones, like this one is Book 6, Lord of Chaos, which is a good book. I genuinely did enjoy it, but it does take a while to get all the puzzle pieces in place before we can kind of get to the ending. You see that also in the 7th book, A Crown of Swords, where, again, the ending very satisfying, and the characters have really great arcs, but there's a lot of kind of meandering and filling up space at the beginning of the book that makes it feel like they could have been a little bit shorter. Now, the world building, as always, is great. So if you like to just exist in this world, then you probably won't be bothered by the longer books. And honestly, it doesn't really bother me that much, but in some cases it is kind of frustrating because you want to move forward, but things just aren't moving at a consistent pace. And then when you get to the end, when things start happening, suddenly the pace ramps up and you're sort of racing to the end, and it feels like you can't catch a break because you're like being pulled along and thrown into the conclusion of the book when you've gotten used to a kind of more meditative pace in the early parts of the book. So that is something to be aware of. The next thing, and I don't know if this is necessarily a bad thing, but it is something that does stand out. There's quite a few like repeated stock phrases and things that, you know, have become almost memes to the fandom thus far. You know, if you've read the first 3 books or the first 2 books, you've probably encountered all of them, and you'll see them kind of being mentioned online. And I understand why those are used. You see that a lot in epic poetry, things like Homer's Odyssey. There's sort of repeated phrases, you know, dawn appeared fresh and rosy-fingered, that kind of thing. And so I can see kind of where Jordan was going with that, because this is ultimately set up as kind of like it's an epic story, and there's this suggestion that the story is part of a poem, like an epic poem that was written after the events of the series. And so, like, I can understand that, but a lot of the stock phrases have to do with the female characters, and so it makes them all feel a little wooden at times. Even though the characters are genuinely really well written, there's lots of phrases, things like Nynaeve tugging her braid, or how they all fold their arms under their breasts, and they just feel like Jordan wanted to make the characters interesting, and so he gave them all like catchphrases in a way, except it's not something they ever say. It's like it feels a little lazy at times because the male characters, there's lots of things that they do. For example, Loyal is described as having kind of a bumblebee voice, which I think is just the cutest thing in the whole world ever. But it just, there's so many descriptions of the female characters that kind of do the same thing over and over and over again. And it just gets a little annoying at times. And you can laugh about it and, you know, enjoy it and move on. It doesn't really affect kind of your reading enjoyment, but it does pull you out a little bit just because every time it comes up, it gets a little funnier. It's almost like it's a running gag, but not in the way that there's other running gags that are genuinely funny. For example, there's one running gag where the three male characters all think that the other two in their group are better at talking to women than they are. And so anytime anything of this comes in, one of them will be like, oh, I wish I was good at talking with women the way, you know, X and Y are. And then you talk to X and they're like, oh, I wish I was as good as talking with women as Y and Z are, that kind of thing. And so, and that is genuinely hilarious. And I love that. But there's these kind of repeated stock phrases when we're dealing with kind of the actions of the women that can get a little annoying at times. Something else to be aware of is that there is a massive cast of characters, and there are a lot of POV characters. We've got the main characters that we spend most of our time with, but we will also get lots of POV chapters from side characters or characters who maybe only appear in one book, kind of thing. And so that is something to be aware of, because there are a few times when I got a little lost because I couldn't remember who this person was, because they were maybe introduced a couple chapters back, and there is a lot of stuff to kind of keep track of. So it's a very big cast. This series obviously rewards rereading, and so once I get to the end, which I am going to do, once I get to the end, I feel like if I come back and reread the series, having already read it, I'll be able to kind of follow a lot of these side plots a little bit better, the subplots. And so that is something to be aware of. There are kind of a lot of characters, and there's a lot of people to kind of juggle and keep track of. And there's some characters whose names are kind of similar to other characters. And it is a little easy to get lost at times. So just be aware of that. And finally, one thing to be aware of is the concept of like gender and queer characters. It was written in the 90s, the very, very early 90s, which isn't really that long ago, but in terms of fantasy novels, it might as well be like a million billion years ago. There were definitely complex sci-fi and fantasy books exploring gender in more nuanced ways written before this, but in terms of like mainstream fantasy, like pop culture mainstream fantasy that was like a super bestseller that everyone loved, the depiction of gender and queer characters is a little, well, no, I'm sugarcoating it. It's a lot outdated. There are lots of strong female characters, like I've said, and the depictions of men and women are very nuanced and, you know, meaningful, but there's no queer characters at all thus far that I've discovered, unless they were really subtly queer coded, and in that case it's always in terms of villainous characters, which goes back to like 1940s and, you know, the Hays Code and all that. And also the male-female relationships in this can be a little frustrating. None of the characters talk with each other, and everyone goes into every relationship assuming everything about the other person. And so everyone feels like it's their own singular responsibility to get the relationship going, and there's very little conversation. Now, again, this is probably just because it's set in kind of a late medieval sort of setting, but still, it can be really, really frustrating, because even though these characters are growing and changing and learning, you have to slog through a whole lot of really almost toxic romance, or toxic descriptions of romance, misinterpretations of things, and people making assumptions about things that aren't true, and people being mad at each other, and everything that could be solved easily if they just talk to each other. And I really am not a fan of that sometimes. Now, the characters on their own are all great, and there is one relationship that I'm really rooting for, and I'm really excited to see where they go, because I love that duo and where that's going. But for everyone else, there is going to be a lot of just lack of communication, and everyone battling their own assumptions. And again, this is probably coming from the fact that a lot of them were raised in a small village, very conservative, and so they don't really have a concept of like healthy communicative relationships. One of them is also he only has one parent, and so he didn't grow up seeing like a husband and wife communicating and talking together. So I can understand, it does fit, you know, in the thing. It isn't out of character, but it can be really annoying sometimes, because oftentimes there's like a relationship that'll come out of absolutely nowhere because we never saw them talking with one another beforehand. It's mostly just they see them across the room and say, wow, they're attractive, I'm in love with them. And then like ages later, the other one's like, oh, you love me. And then like they're a thing. And you're like, what? So it, you know, be aware of that. It's kind of annoying sometimes, but there's still 7 more books, and I'm confident that these characters will grow and mature and learn how to talk to the other person in the relationship like grown adults. So with that all said, will I keep reading the series? Personally, yes, I will keep reading it. I love the characters. I love where they're going. I really am looking forward to getting some answers about a lot of the long-running mysteries. I'm curious to see how the characters will grow and change and develop. And there's a lot of developments happening kind of at this point in the series that I really want to see keep going. There's some very, very cool things that I genuinely want to keep up with, and I do want to make it to the end. Even though the next few books are kind of referred to as the slog by a lot of people, the final 3 books, co-written with Brandon Sanderson after Robert Jordan's death, I've told are completely worth it, and I do need to just stick it out through maybe a few slower books to get to those final 3. So I am going to keep reading. In terms of recommending this to others, I would say if you're looking for a faster plot progression, a little more action focused, I would probably not recommend this. This is a world where you kind of exist in it, and it's not as focused on plot as it is character arcs. And so you're kind of moving with these characters through life in real time. If you're a fan of, for example, the Outlander series by Diana Gabaldon, that's the same kind of vibe, where it's less focused on like breakneck plot, although there's some books in that series that are like that, but it's more about just existing with these people and growing and changing with them. So there is overall plot arcs and threads that you will follow, but this isn't a like breakneck, you know, move from this to this to this to this really quickly kind of series. There are some books that are faster than others, but overall the pacing is a bit slower. So be aware of that. It's more like, I'm using a modern fantasy analog. It feels more like Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson more than Mistborn, also by Brandon Sanderson. So Mistborn is much faster paced, and it's set up in trilogies, so it's shorter. Things happen faster, you get faster character arcs, but you don't get as much of the kind of rich world building. And so Stormlight is more like that, where it's much longer books, you spend more time with the characters, things progress a little more organically over time. And so if you're a fan of that kind of approach to fantasy, then I think you would like this. If you're looking for something where you kind of immediately get sucked in, I would maybe suggest trying something out or like else. Now, I will say the first 3 books of the series, you can almost read those as a standalone trilogy. There's obviously going to be a lot of stuff that isn't resolved, but there is sort of one big question that's answered, that's sort of asked in the first book, and it's answered in the third book, and you get sort of a conclusion of sorts. So if you want to just check it out, I'd say maybe go to your library and maybe just read like the first 3 books. And if you're not completely invested and sucked in and you don't really want to keep reading, then I would say that's totally fine. You can try something else and you don't have to make that massive commitment and get all the way to the end before you think so. I tend to like slower stuff because, I don't know, maybe I'm boring, but I tend to like slower stuff, so I'm okay with just sort of existing in the world, even when it's frustrating and even when I can't really follow what's happening at times. Once I get to the end of the book, I'm always like, okay, all right, that was good. I do want to keep going. So I would recommend this if you want to just live in a fantasy world for a while and see characters grow and change, sometimes painfully, frustratingly, realistically, because some of these characters are just morons at the beginning and you just want to shake them and just be like, you need to grow up. But of course, like, they're teenagers at the beginning. So, you know, we were all dumb when we were that age, so it's fine. But stick with it if you want to just sort of exist in this world, and it is worth it. I think the payoffs at the end of each book are genuinely good enough to keep you going. But if you're wanting something a little faster paced, wanting something that's a little bit more contemporary in how it treats gender, and if you want something that has more queer representation, then this probably isn't for you. That is kind of the one thing that sort of is frustrating, is because everybody in this book is just painfully straight. And so hopefully that changes. I don't know if it will, but we'll see. So that is my part 1, I guess, of my thoughts on the Wheel of Time thus far. I am going to keep reading. I'm going to do another video when I get to the end, and we'll see if my opinions of the series have changed at that point. So thank you so much for watching this, and I really appreciate your support as I am early on in the process of creating this channel. So thank you so much.